Hello, everyone. It's 1 p.m. Eastern, and that means it's time to begin our 91st CoCoRaHS Weather Talk webinar. A very warm welcome to all of you joining us today. I'm your host, meteorologist Henry Regis. Running the technical side of our program is my colleague, Noah Newman. We're coming to you live from the Colorado Climate Center here in sunny Fort Collins, Colorado. A big thanks to our donors out there, as your gifts are used to sponsor our Weather Talk webinars. There we go, among many other CoCoRaHS endeavors. For today's webinar, we have the pleasure of having with us Peter Goble from right here in the Colorado Climate Center. Peter recently became Colorado's Assistant State Climatologist. Peter will speak about something that you may not have given much thought to, and that's drought-related changes in our forests. A little background on Peter: he received his master's degree from Colorado State, and is Colorado State's new okay, sorry about that, folks. Is the new state assistant state. Boy, I'm sorry. Let me reread that. So he received his master's from Colorado State University and is the CoCoRaHS state coordinator for CoCoRaHS. There we go. I was having trouble getting that out, but we got through it. His hobbies include running, hiking, and for running, he didn't win, but he ran in the 2019 Boston Marathon. He also roots for the Broncos and the Minnesota Twins. So let's give a big CoCoRaHS welcome to our colleague, Peter. Peter, it's great to have you with us today.
Thanks so much, Henry. I'll go ahead and share my screen.
Okay, well, let me ask you as we start off today's program, we asked this question to all of our guests. How did you become interested in weather? And was there a single event?
Yeah, you know what? It was really a mix for me. I think a lot of meteorologists and climatologists have that story of kind of the one event that really got them plugged into weather. I don't think I was quite that way. I was always really interested in thunderstorms. I loved when it would rain really hard. I loved it in the winter when it would snow really hard. And I was a kid who always loved being outside, so I was just kind of in tune with the weather. And so that's kind of how I became interested in weather.
Thanks, Peter. Well, that's good to know. Hey, we're going to give you the controls now, and we'll be back with questions at the end of your talk.
That sounds great. Just to confirm, you are seeing my slide right now?
They look good.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much, Henry and Noah, for having me on today. And thanks so much, everyone, for being here. When Noah told me that there were over 200 people registered, I was really tickled because this is just a kind of a more niche Weather Talk webinar than I think that you see a lot of the time. We're not talking about the really fun tornadoes, blizzards, hurricanes, the really big weather events that I think are kind of the catalysts for a lot of people getting into weather. Today, we're talking about drought, and we're talking about conditions in forested areas where not a lot of people live. And furthermore, there's kind of a bias here towards what's going on in Colorado, because that's where the work that we've done so far has been conducted. Although I think that this kind of work could have applications certainly in a lot of places around the United States, and we'd love to see it expand. I do want to take a minute and thank the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS, for sponsoring this work. And I want to thank the US Forest Service for participating in the work I'll be sharing today. And of course, to the many CoCoRaHS observers, not only just for being a part of CoCoRaHS, but also to those who participate in condition monitoring and may or may not have participated in this project. So, measuring beyond precipitation, how is your forest responding to drought? Okay, we already did a little bit of the about me. Henry gave a really nice introduction, so I'll skip some of this, but one of the things that I wanted to mention was I actually started with CoCoRaHS as just an undergrad student, an intern in 2011. So I've been a member of the Colorado Climate Center in some capacity for quite a while now, starting as a starting as an undergraduate student, and then over time, working my way up through grad school and as a researcher. And Henry was able to provide me with a picture from when I started at the Colorado Climate Center. And I thought this picture was a lot of fun to show. So there's a number of things that I think are fun about this photo. Number one, that beautiful old Dell computer that we're looking at. We're also looking at an old CoCoRaHS map. I don't know how well you can see that, but we're looking at, I believe it's a county in kind of the Tampa Bay area on the old CoCoRaHS map. And then I just think this picture is kind of a fun picture of me from back then because, it almost looks like I've been crying. And I think that's really funny because I promise you that Henry's a really nice guy. He never made me cry as an intern. We always got along great. So I thought that was kind of a
I
fun.
think you were just very emotional there looking at those images,
Yeah,
Peter.
just happy to be where I was at. Before I worked at the Climate Center, I worked in a warehouse. So those are probably tears of joy right there. You're right, Henry. All right, and then Henry kind of mentioned this as well, but I have always been very outdoorsy, and so not only has the weather always been very interesting to me, but I've also always cared about these forested ecosystems because those are great places to recreate outdoors. I love our Colorado mountains and mountain meteorology that goes with it, and I love the thunderstorms that can pop up when you're up in the mountains and change a clear day into a lightning hazard in 15 minutes. And so not only have I done a couple marathons, like Henry mentioned, I've also climbed over 20 of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks. And this is actually a picture from the saddle of Mount Sneffels looking south from the third week of July, believe it or not, just last year. And this is notable because of how much snow you still see up in the high country in that third week of July. It was certainly a big snow season. And actually, this is one of those mountains that I didn't summit because there was more snow and ice than I would have expected at that point in the season. One final thing before we get into the meat of this talk, just kind of relating to CoCoRaHS observers here. I am a CoCoRaHS observer. My CoCoRaHS station goes back to June of 2019. You might wonder why it took me so long to become an observer when I was an intern with CoCoRaHS in 2011. And, I just faced one of the barriers that I think a lot of people in their 20s face when they want to get involved and are interested in the weather of I lived in an apartment. I lived in a number of different apartments over this time frame. So I was itching to get into CoCoRaHS, but I just couldn't until we were finally able, my wife and I, to get a house, and I had a yard where we could set up the rain gauge. And so here's some of my data sense. I have done a fair number of multi-day reports, but I do have every day covered since we started. I am not consistent with reporting condition monitoring, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, which is a shame because I recognize as a data user of these condition monitoring reports that they're very valuable. So if you are a consistent condition monitoring reporter, thank you so much for everything that you do. And please, in the future, I would appreciate it if you kept me honest as well. Okay, so for today's agenda, we're going to be talking about, first off, why it's important to monitor conditions in forests. Then we'll talk about how we currently monitor conditions in forests. We'll talk about the US Drought Monitor a little bit because the US Drought Monitor is one of the organizations that's keenly interested in improved condition monitoring in forests. We'll talk a little bit about climate change in Colorado and a little bit about climate change around the US and why it's important to monitor conditions consistently in forests as things change. We'll talk a bit about some of the work that we've done with the US Forest Service, our call for forest condition monitors, and some of the progress we made over the 2 years that this project was really going strong in 2021, 2022, and some related projects and where we might be able to go from here. All right, so why monitor forests? Well, one thing that many folks may not know about our forests across the United States, this is not just Colorado, but many folks across the United States, their water actually originates as precipitation that falls in forests. So at CoCoRaHS, we do something called watershed mapping. If you've never checked out the watershed maps on the CoCoRaHS website, that's something that I would recommend. They're really cool. But if you trace kind of your local river or stream back to its origins, oftentimes these are coming out of forested areas. And so the water that we use for drinking, for recreation, for growing food, oftentimes it's originating coming out of forests. Of course, forests are beautiful and important for human recreation. A lot of our national parks are in forested lands, and they're important to maintain and be good stewards of for that reason. And then one that might be a little bit less obvious, they're huge sources of biodiversity, which is really important, as well as other perhaps more obvious natural resources like timber. And when we consider all this, it's also important to note that long-term changes and natural variations in climate, as well as our hydrologic cycle, are going to necessitate different kind of forest management and maintenance strategies, and therefore we can be better stewards of the land if we are better about monitoring it. Okay, so this project was initially dreamed up actually at a National Soil Moisture Workshop in Manhattan, Kansas in 2019, in conjunction with some folks from the US Forest Service Office of Sustainability and Climate, particularly Cindy West with US Forest Service OSC. The picture on the right-hand side is not of Manhattan, Kansas. That is the Maroon Bells in Colorado. But we talked about how we are underrepresenting condition monitoring reports in forests, not just from a CoCoRaHS standpoint, but overall, and how that has an impact on things like the US Drought Monitor. And at the time, there was thought about how maybe US Forest Service employees could be a bigger part of the solution. That portion of the equation didn't necessarily materialize as well as we would have liked, but that's where the project starts. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we monitor conditions in forests and then what CoCoRaHS adds to that equation. So we'll start by talking about some of the meteorological conditions and how we measure those in forested areas. And we'll start with temperature and precipitation here. Some of the networks that are doing this include the Cooperative Observer Network, or COOP, which is run by the National Weather Service. This is kind of our longest running weather and climate monitoring network across the United States, and in many ways the backbone of our understanding of our climate across the United States. There's the Snowpack Telemetry Network, which is monitoring things at high elevations and forests all across the western US. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. RAWS, this is actually a picture of a RAWS station from near Black Canyon of the Gunnison. And the RAWS network is great not only for measuring temperature and precipitation, but also some of the meteorological conditions associated with wildfire danger. And of course, wildfires have been a major issue in terms of forest management over the last few decades across the Western United States, as well as Canada and Alaska. So definitely a major issue, and those RAWS stations are very important. And then we do have some CoCoRaHS observers who live in forests, and they were very important for this project that we're talking about here today. We measure meteorological conditions in forests using satellite and radar. So the satellites that are being launched by NASA and monitoring conditions all around the globe. We can use these to kind of fill in the gaps in forests, although satellites have some limitations in forests that are important and end up being important when it comes to underrepresenting conditions in forests. For instance, satellites struggle more sometimes when you have a thick tree canopy, as you do in some forests. They can struggle over rugged, complex terrain, as you have in many forests. Radar is really important, but also a problem here in Colorado and in many forests around the United States, where we're looking at areas with highly varied terrain, with mountains, with steep slopes. And so radar doesn't necessarily capture things all that well all the time, because you have areas where the radar beams can be blocked. Okay, so now we're looking at more hydrologic conditions, and here we're looking at a picture of a modern day snowpack telemetry or SNOTEL station run by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Monitoring snow in forests, particularly high elevation forests, really took off in the Western US starting in California back in the 1930s, where folks would go up and cross-country ski to these certain tracts of forested land and monitor the snow in that area, starting with these large metal cylinders that they would plunge into the snowfield and excavate a snow core sample and measure the snow water equivalent, very similar to what CoCoRaHS observers do during the winter nowadays. And of course, some of these snow monitoring sites can get absolutely buried. So some of the equipment that they used was a lot bigger than a CoCoRaHS gauge. And if we look at the modern day equipment, certainly a lot bigger than the CoCoRaHS gauge. You might notice the precipitation gauge on the right-hand side of this picture. It's at least 8 feet off the ground. The reason the precipitation gauge is so high off the ground is because the snow can absolutely get that high in some of these areas. And so if you want to continue to monitor precipitation throughout the winter season in some of these forested areas, and you're not in an area where people are reasonably going to get there and be shoveling every day, you have to make sure you have some pretty hardy equipment. Similarly, that solar panel is way above the ground. The solar panel is what's being used to power this weather station. So if you want to get this kind of information all winter long, you better make sure that's well above the ground. That big kind of slab towards the bottom left of the picture is what we call a snow pillow, and that is weighing the snow and getting that snow water equivalent reading like we talked about, similar to what CoCoRaHS observers do. Okay, one of the other ways that we monitor specifically water in forests is these streamflow conditions. Largely, these are monitored by the US Geological Survey, but when the snow melts in the winter, it's really important to get a sense for how much water is going to be coming into our reservoirs so we can manage those. And so these stream gauges are also a really important way of measuring hydrological and climatological conditions in Colorado forests. One last thing that I'll get to before I get to what's missing and where this project really comes in is some of the things that we can do with satellites are really neat in terms of measuring vegetative health. So this is an example of a map produced by the US Department of Agriculture using satellite data. And all the shaded areas you're looking at are some of the forests around the United States. And they're color-coded based on something called Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. And what we're doing is we're monitoring using satellite data how efficiently our forests are absorbing near-infrared radiation. So when things are nice and moist and the forests are healthy, the near-infrared radiation gets absorbed very effectively. And we can see that on satellite, versus when we have drier conditions or drought-like conditions, we will see that the near-infrared radiation isn't absorbed the same way. And so what this is doing is actually categorizing what those NDVI readings look like compared to a normal year, and then ranking it in a way that kind of matches the US Drought Monitor, which we'll talk a little bit more about in just a couple slides here. where the areas that are showing reds and oranges are areas that, based on this metric, we're seeing severe or extreme drought in forests. And then the greens are where we're seeing normal to the dark greens, and the blues are above normal or more moist than normal type conditions. All right, so we've talked about all the ways that we're monitoring forests, but what's missing here and why is that important? One critical gap is soil moisture. Soil moisture tends to be very crucial in forests because soil moisture is a leading indicator to the health of our vegetation, which in turn can be a leading indicator to the health of our forest wildlife. But soil moisture, we measure it at a few sites in forests, not nearly as much as we could. We do have some models that try to get at this, but the models tend to have large errors, and it tends to remain largely unknown. And this can be a problem for a number of reasons. I already mentioned it can be a leading indicator for forest health, but it also can be a leading indicator for what's going to happen in the coming runoff season. So, for instance, if we're in one of our western forests that builds a snowpack throughout the winter season, that snowpack is going to be used to forecast our water supply for the coming year. But if we don't know the soil moisture, we don't know how much of that snowpack is ultimately going to go into recharging our soils rather than filling our lake streams and reservoirs. Consistent monitoring of the vegetation itself across a lot of these forest stands is a key data gap and something that we really need to do a better job of in both determining how forest health is changing over time in the long term, but also how it's responding to some of these year-to-year variations that we're trying to catalog using resources like the United States Drought Monitor that we'll talk about in just a minute. And then, we talked about vegetation health, but one of the specific things that stood out when we started to survey folks for this project is variation in tree health. There's a couple concerns there. In Colorado, tree health is really important in determining how kind of fortified our forests are against not only wildfires, but also invasive species outbreaks. For instance, the amount of sap in our trees can be an indicator of whether or not it will withstand an infestation from pine or bark beetles. In Colorado here, following the drought of 2002, really 2000 through 2002, we saw this major takeoff in pine beetles across Colorado. And it was largely due to the fact that those trees didn't have the sap to kind of withstand these beetle outbreaks. But then we saw a similar thing with spruce beetles in the 2010s in southern Colorado. And then early bloom and late senescence, things like that can be key variables that we could do a better job tracking to see how forests are responding to changing meteorological conditions. Certainly this time of year in Colorado, there's a lot of what we call leaf peepers, or people who go to look at our forests during peak fall colors. Knowing how that's changing and how the quality of that is changing is important, not only for tracking forest health, but also thinking about recreation. Okay, so we know that the US Forest Service, who we worked closely with on this, is monitoring conditions across forests all across the United States. The US Forest Service is, and here in Colorado, the State Forest Service. Many other states have a State Forest Service as well that may be monitoring things. These projects take on a multitude of different variations. One of the biggest things that the Forest Service deals with is decisions about when and where to thin forests in order to make them more resilient to things like wildfire and invasive species outbreaks. And they are monitoring forests, but not necessarily on as regular an interval as they themselves would like a lot of the time. And a lot of the time, these kind of monitoring efforts aren't as well archived as they could be if things were being done more like what we do with CoCoRaHS, where you can go back and find condition monitoring reports from any report that you've given going back to when condition monitoring reports were started. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the US Drought Monitor. The US Drought Monitor is one of the kind of key interested parties when it comes to this work, because the US Drought Monitor is an expert-based appraisal that's done week to week of drought conditions across the United States. And the US Drought Monitor relies on a lot of these meteorological and hydrological indicators that we've already talked about, but it also relies on impact reports. And the US Drought Monitor tends to get more impact reports from more agricultural areas or urban and suburban areas, but they don't necessarily get the impact reports they need in forested areas. So these forest impacts tend to be underrepresented in forested areas by the US Drought Monitor. And these conditions do certainly matter. What the US Drought Monitor shows matters, not just for posterity's sake, but it's also tied to some federal disaster relief programs. One example is the livestock forage program, which would make you think more agricultural lands. But then there are also places in forested areas that do grazing permits, and agriculture and forests sometimes do go hand in hand. So the US Drought Monitor always looking for more impact related data. And that's where if we were collecting more condition monitoring reports in some of these forested areas, that could be a major help to the US Drought Monitor. Before I advance, just for those who don't know, the US Drought Monitor is kind of it's a percentile-based classification scheme. So these colors that you're seeing, if it's showing white on the US Drought Monitor, that means that they're saying no drought or conditions are reflective of kind of above the 30th percentile in moisture. The areas highlighted in yellow, which is quite a bit of the country, is showing as abnormally dry, which is designed by the US Drought Monitor to be reflective of the 20th to 30th percentile. D1 is, or the tan color, is the 10th to 20th. The orange, D2, severe drought, is the 5th to 10th. Red, extreme drought, is 2nd to 5th. And then the dark red or exceptional, that basically means the US Drought Monitor is saying, hey, this is like the worst on record that we've seen it. If the data go back long enough, potentially the second worst on record. But that's the baddest of the bad there. Okay, another reason that we really want to do a better job monitoring forests long-term is to know how they're responding to long-term shifts in conditions. So our office at the Colorado Climate Center recently put together kind of a synthesis of what our observations show in terms of how our meteorological variables and hydrological variables are shifting over time across the state. And we see here that recent trend, certainly warmer. We have high confidence in that. Precipitation lower, but we've got lower confidence in that, and the projected future there is more uncertain. But then we're also looking at the hydrological cycle, which is important to our forests, of snowpack, runoff timing, stream flow. But what we're not getting here, that's motivation for getting more condition monitoring reports in forests, is again how our soils, our plants, our animals responding to all this. All right, so this is where CoCoRaHS could really fit in a big way, in my opinion, and already has. I'll show an example of that here in just a few slides. Is we have a wealth of these wonderful, educated, interested observers from all across the country. Henry will have to correct me at the end if I'm wrong, but I believe it's over 20,000 active observers across the United States, as well as Canada and territories like Puerto Rico, Guam. So we've got this awesome active observer base that can help contribute to
I'll jump in
this,
right
not
now.
only with precipitation measurements, but also with condition monitoring reports potentially.
Yeah, Peter, I'll jump in right now. We have
Yeah.
27,500 as of last count. So
yeah, that's absolutely amazing. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do is increase the number of condition monitoring reports in forested areas across the state. I'm not going to assume that everyone on this call knows what condition monitoring is. For those who may not know, condition monitoring is something offered through CoCoRaHS. It's an ideally once a week, but it can be once a month. It can be on irregular intervals. Ideally once a week, anecdotal appraisal of whether conditions in your area are drier or wetter than normal, given the time of year. These local impact reports are key. The US Drought Monitor loves these reports. These are something that we started again through funding from the National Integrated Drought Information System. And the graphic at the bottom here is just trying to show an example of what dry, normal, and wet may look like, but across the country, this looks wildly different based on location and based on time of year. Okay, now we're looking at an example of a condition monitoring reporting form and an example of a completed condition monitoring report. So on the right-hand side is the form. If you're used to reporting through the app, I don't believe that condition monitoring is in the app yet, but if you log on to the CoCoRaHS website and look at the Enter My New Reports section on the left-hand side of the page, there's an option for condition monitoring. You can go into that and you can select it and you can fill out one of these reports on the right, which the first thing there is the date that you made this observation. The second thing is a radio button where you fill in anecdotally, given your location and your time of year, how much drier or wetter than normal are things right now. The most important part of these reports, particularly when we talk about the US Drought Monitor, is the comments. So it's really the comments that give us the impact reports that we can sink our teeth into and know what's going on in that area. And then the report categories at the bottom just allows you to check which different sectors you might have noticed have been impacted. So for instance, my garden this summer with the drier than normal summer we had was completely ripped up by grasshoppers. If I was filling out a condition monitoring report, I would have absolutely been talking about how we were taken over by grasshoppers and it killed a lot of our flowers and vegetables that we were growing. Okay, the left-hand side of this is showing an example of a great condition monitoring report from just last summer down near Ordway, Colorado. Still no big rains, but rains almost daily. They checked mildly wet here, you can see at the bottom. Pea-sized hail on the 4th of July. Pea to golf ball size hail on Saturday. I hope they filled out a hail report as well, especially with that roof and tree damage. Grasshoppers thinning a little bit. Blister beetles have arrived. They'll work on that. Deer and pastures, coyote in the distance, many different birds. And so we're getting all this information about plants and wildlife that we'd love to do a better job monitoring and tracking long term. And so we'd love to see that. And one of the things that we noticed with this project was that prior to this project, we were really getting more reports from suburban and urban areas like what you see in the circle there in northern Colorado, and from rural agricultural areas like what you see in the circle in southeastern Colorado, but not really getting much in the way of condition monitoring reports in forests. So we wanted to see if we could change that. All right, so we've kind of gone over the motivation here, but just to recap, conditions on forests are underrepresented by CoCoRaHS Condition Monitoring, but we care a great deal about how forests are changing on short and long timescales. A database of forest condition impact reports would be valuable to management communities within the forest in monitoring climate change, drought, floods, and beyond. And then additional monitoring in forests could help forest managers with their goals. And we know that because we surveyed the US Forest Service and State Forest Service on some of their needs. So we actually got into some webinars with the State Forest Service and US Forest Service, some of the offices across the state, and we were able to get some survey feedback on what some of their needs were for monitoring in forests. And we can get into some of that survey feedback here. So What are your biggest management challenges? Well, the biggest one around here was increased forest vegetation drought stress. That still is a big deal, as well as increasing tree mortality. We've talked about some of the reasons for that. We'd love to do a better job managing that. Changes in human use seasonally, and changes in invasive species, another thing that we've talked about so far. We were asking Forest Service personnel what data that they're using, and it turned out that a lot of them were using the US Drought Monitor. So in that sense, if we can get more condition monitoring reports in forested areas, we can make the US Drought Monitor more accurate, which in turn would appear to help the Forest Service. Okay, one of the things that came up consistently is that Forest Service employees are constantly monitoring forests, but not necessarily archiving their observations in a way that is most conducive to making the best management decisions going forward. We asked, how are folks in the U.S. Forest Service or State Forest Service storing data related to shifts in environmental conditions? We got some don't know there. We store it locally in Dropbox. A large part of our data will become publicly available if EPA decides to release it, so kind of out of their control there. We keep the raw data, but no one is tracking extreme event shifts. We don't have a data manager. Can you help with this? Or we do not store this data. So those were some of our responses there. And so we worked to improve the number of condition monitoring condition monitoring reports in forested areas across Colorado throughout 2021 and 2022. Not still working on this. The funding for that project was just over 2 years. So in 2024, we're not actively working on this, but it's still definitely a need. And we worked to improve condition monitoring reports in forests in 3 ways. We did some recruiting efforts with the help of some local coordinators in Western Colorado and areas with forests to get more CoCoRaHS observers on board. I sent out some regular reminders to submit condition monitoring reports, as well as thank yous to observers who did. And then we also tried to get folks who work for the Forest Service into CoCoRaHS. And that was, again, the avenue that was the least successful of the 3. We were more successful with just CoCoRaHS being CoCoRaHS and trying to double our efforts in some of these areas. And we did see progress. So we saw that the number of condition monitoring reports in that May through September timeframe improved from 346 in our forested areas in 2021 to 610 in 2022. We are back down in 2023, but not all the way to 2021 levels. And some of the standouts were Archuleta County and Plata County down in kind of the Pagosa Springs and Durango areas, where we saw a big increase in reporting. And this was very helpful to the US Drought Monitor. So we'd love to see more efforts like this in the future. It turned out that 2022 was a big period of drought amelioration in Southwest Colorado. So we went into the summer of 2022 in kind of the moderate to severe drought depiction on the US Drought Monitor in southwestern Colorado. But throughout the course of the summer, we had some very timely rains that reduced fire danger, brought up the rivers a little bit, and also helped with forest health. And the CoCoRaHS condition monitoring reports throughout this time period were helpful with trying to determine that the US Drought Monitor was accurate in these areas throughout the 2022 season, and not going too fast with sort of improving these conditions. One really fun part of this project for me was getting to interact with somebody who's a bit of a local celebrity. Billy Barr is a gentleman who lives up in a cabin high in the forests of Colorado, kind of to the north of Crested Butte near Gothic. His name is spelled with lowercase b's. He's insistent on that. But he's this great character who keeps these meticulous notes about vegetation and wildlife up at his cabin, as well as being an awesome CoCoRaHS observer. And this picture, actually, you can see he's watering a greenhouse that he's got up at his cabin. And in the background, what's behind him, out just outside his window, is a wall of snow. So he's kind of snowed in there working in a greenhouse. And so that was fun to have Billy Barr involved with this project. All right, some of the challenges that we've faced along the way, and I've talked about some of these as we've gone. Forests are sparsely populated, so reaching the right observers can be difficult, though we did have some success. Adding additional protocols to the plates of Forest Service workers was definitely met with friction and red tape, or we would have loved to have a lot more Forest Service workers actually becoming CoCoRaHS observers and submitting these reports. That we didn't see much of that. Forest Service employees are very mobile. Some of the condition monitoring that they're just doing throughout their day-to-day is not necessarily in the same spot, which is a problem given that CoCoRaHS condition monitoring reports are tied to a location. I'll talk about how we can kind of circumvent that in just a minute, but we found that, in some areas, the Forest Service employees are only measuring conditions on a given tract of forest once every decade. So from a long-term change standpoint, that can be useful to have one thorough condition monitoring report every decade, but certainly from a climate variability and drought standpoint, that's definitely not anywhere near enough. Let's see here. One of the things that came up is, how can we make these condition monitoring reports more sticky, more fun? So if you're like me, you probably just checking your gauge is a part of your routine in the morning. And it's kind of like that morning cup of coffee. You maybe even look forward to it like I do. And so checking the gauge, it's just a sticky activity that people just do day after day. Whereas these condition monitoring reports, they're sticky for some folks, but if you're like me, a reminder to do these reports goes a long way, because I certainly don't mind doing it. It's not a pain, but it's not something that I'll just do kind of naturally on the day to day. Let's see. I'm gonna skip ahead one here. One of the kind of complementary protocols going on is the condition monitor observer reports that are being run by the US Drought Monitor. These are done through an app called Survey 123 that gets reported just using the GPS coordinates on your phone. Again, there is a dearth of these reports in forested areas, but this is one way that we could potentially in the future get more people who are just hikers in an area to tell us what they're seeing in different forested areas. So this is one area where there's potential in the future. Part of this work was talking with forests around the United States. Had a really interesting conversation with a forested region up in New England, where their biggest concern was timber equipment getting stuck in mud because they didn't necessarily have the reports to know how muddy it was. And so that's one potential offshoot of this work, is monitoring mud in terms of forested areas in parts of the country that are maybe a little bit wetter than what we see in Colorado. So I'll go ahead and wrap there, but if there's any questions, it looks like we have plenty of time to address questions, comments, concerns. Thank you again so much for joining us. Thanks, Henry and Noah, for putting this on, and it was a delight to be with you today.
Well, thank you, Peter. We really enjoyed your talk as well. One thing I'll mention out there for folks, condition reports, there's a new app, CoCoRaHS app, will be coming out in early October. And on that app, you'll be able to put condition reports in right from your phone. So be on the lookout for that. That'll be coming out shortly. Okay, let's take some questions for Peter here. And again, if he's not able to answer them all, he'll try to do that via email. So here's one from Tom, and he says, in Colorado, how much more resistant to drought are forests than grasslands, and is that quantifiable?
That's a really great question, Tom. I would say that it's more about the time scale than how resistant the location actually is. So grasslands tend to be very sensitive to short-term drought, or what we sometimes call flash drought, where grasslands can go from being healthy to looking quite unhealthy in just a matter of a few weeks. But the flip side to that is that grasslands also recover more quickly. So, for instance, if we have dry grasslands and forage production isn't keeping up with a normal year, if you get some timely rains in May, June, even into July, that can turn around pretty quickly where we can see the grass actually catch up to where we would expect forage production to be in a normal year if we get a couple weeks of well above average moisture. Forests are kind of the flip side of that coin, where our forests, if you have one dry year or one bad year, typically our forests in Colorado can withstand that quite nicely. But the impacts really come in when we get these multi-year droughts, like what we saw in 2000 through 2002, and then 2020 through 2022, where we end up with this more consistent drawdown of soil moisture through some of the deep root systems that forests have. And so we really watch out for these long multi-year hydrologic droughts.
Okay, thanks. We've got another one here. So this is a two-part question, or two different people asking us.
Sure.
Jakir and Nancy both are asking some similar stuff. Jakir says normal is no longer a single thing as the atmosphere is being continually warmed. When we report conditions relative to normal, are we using some sort of sliding scale? And then Nancy, and I just lost her question here that was on the screen. She wanted to know how to find out about measuring drought in Colorado. How would you
Yeah.
normal
Sorry, Henry.
in Colorado? Yeah.
It was how do you know what's normal? Was the question. How do you know what is normal for each season? Sorry, I popped that out of the screen, Henry.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the how do you know what is normal? Typically, with normal being a sliding scale, like you said, where things are changing over time, what climatologists do is we tend to look at how things compare to roughly the last 30 years of data. If you haven't lived at your place long enough, you can, specify this is relative to what I've seen since, say, 2010. We see a lot in agricultural areas that folks will reference previous droughts. Like, this is the worst that I've seen since 2006, or the worst that I've seen since 2002. So that can be helpful. But it's certainly an important point that you don't necessarily know what normal is if you haven't been there very long. And that's one of the issues that we've run into with condition monitoring reports. One thing that I'll add to that, though, is that if you're a little bit off on the radio button that you check, like maybe you say mildly dry when it's actually moderately dry, we don't have a specific percentile ranking with each one of those. So it really comes down to the most important thing is the comments you submit and the impacts that we see. So that's one thing that we're always looking more for. And one thing that US Drought Monitor is always looking for more of is impacts data. And so those comments can be really helpful for trying to arbitrate.
Thanks. Here's one from Angie, and she's from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, actually letting us know that the acorns are on the increase this year there. But she
Okay.
also wants to know what would be a good way to start out monitoring soil moisture. So is there some way she can do that?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways that you can do that. CoCoRaHS does have a soil moisture monitoring protocol. It's a manual soil moisture monitoring protocol. So it's actually using a soil moisture monitoring kit that includes this brass ring of known volume where you excavate a chunk of soil of known volume and then dry it using an oven or a toaster oven. And then the difference in the weight of the soil sample before and after drying it tells us how much moisture was there. Having said that, it's pretty labor intensive. So I also encourage people to think about soil sensors and maybe looking into some low-cost soil sensor options. And one group that's done a lot of work there is the Alabama State Climate Office. Lee Ellenberg, the assistant state climatologist of Alabama, has done a lot of work with low-cost soil sensor technology down in that area. And I would be more than happy to follow up via email and get you in touch with him and talk about how you may be able to monitor soil moisture at your place. I also remembered that there was a question from earlier that I didn't get to about how do we know what's normal in Colorado specifically. So our office actually has a drought web page that we use to track a bunch of different potential drought indicators across the state. It uses a lot of the resources that we've talked about earlier in this talk. So it uses precipitation data, including from CoCoRaHS, but it also uses precipitation data from SNOTEL, from Co-op. We're looking at temperature data. We're looking at satellite sensed vegetative health. We're looking at modeled soil moisture. And we're couching that all in a climate context where we're looking at all the years of record and seeing, how many years is this year above, how many is it below, where does it rank in terms of a percentile. So yeah, if there's more there, feel free to send me an email. My email's on this slide, and we can follow up and talk more about what's normal in Colorado.
Here's one from Tommy in Ohio, and he says he lives in a D3 drought area right now. Are there any other ways you can help besides reporting zeros and condition monitoring reports? And so you might want to mention about the ET program. We have the ET gauge.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I would say that by reporting your zeros, that's one of the most important things you can do. And these condition monitoring reports are also important. So you're already doing a lot, and we already are very grateful for everything that you're doing. But one option, if you wanted to look into other protocols that are useful from a drought monitoring standpoint, is CoCoRaHS does offer what's called an ET gauge, which is available through weatheryourway.com. And the ET gauges are kind of monitoring the inverse of what you're monitoring with your precipitation gauge, where it's basically monitoring the effective thirst of the atmosphere for water vapor or the evaporative demand. And what you do, you're filling this container with distilled water. It has a little felt piece on top, and it's designed to mimic the water loss over, I believe it's turf grass. Henry, you'd have to correct me if I'm wrong on that, but
That is correct. Yep. Turf.
Yeah, those ET ratings can help us determine, based on temperature, cloud cover, humidity, wind speeds, what's how quickly the kind of land surface is losing moisture to the atmosphere.
Thanks. Here's a couple. Here's another one here. John wants to know, he lives in Vermont, and how do the combinations of moisture and drought affect foliage colors? He's saying that here in central Vermont, they had a flash flood back in July, but a very dry August. But it's early, but colors are muted so far. So do you know can you explain any of that?
Yeah, so I'm not as much of an expert on this as I would like. One person that I know is an expert in this state is Dan West with the Forest Service. And Dan may from there be able to get us in touch with somebody in the Vermont area. What little I do know about that is both too wet and too dry can mute the colors. I think that around here, we tend to see more colorful foliage during a wetter fall, but we're a climatologically semi-arid region here in Colorado. versus Vermont is less moisture limited. You get more precipitation up there than we do, and so that's one of those areas where colors colors can be a little bit more muted because there's too much moisture.
Okay, thanks for that one. Here's Eva in Florida, and she wants to know how would reliability, the reliability, I'm not speaking well today, reliability to assess, measure dryness in ravine, hammock, and bottomland areas to accurately depict these areas. So how would measuring the dryness in that help? I think that's what she's asking.
Okay. I'm not 100% sure I know what she's talking about when it comes to ravine, hammock, and bottomland areas. Is that something specific to the geography of Florida?
I think you see that a lot in the Everglades. You'll see these hammocks,
Oh, okay.
areas that stick up there above the water level.
Yeah, that's another one that's a bit outside my wheelhouse, unfortunately. But I know that one of the ways that uh, coastal wetlands are measuring um, drought conditions is by the kind of tidal inflow or the saltwater inflow into inland areas, where when you have sufficient fresh water, the salt water doesn't protrude inland as far. I know they've done some work with that in coastal Carolina with the condition monitoring group, and that may be more similar to what's going on down in the Everglades. So is Kristen Lackstrom still with that group? That might be a good group to get in touch with.
Yeah, I think she is.
Yeah.
Okay, here's one from Nate, or excuse me, Nat. Nat wants to know, he lives at 7,200 feet and the soil tends to be sandy and it does not hold moisture too well. Is it still worth monitoring the soil moisture?
Yeah, so that can be pretty tricky up in some of our high elevation areas, that the soil at the surface will be sandy and the water will penetrate through rather quickly and get into deeper layers. I know that ideally for better water supply forecasts, like I talked about, we'd love to know what the soil moisture is looking like all the way down to like 6 feet, which is completely an unreasonable depth for citizen science observers to be measuring, since that's so labor intensive. But I know that folks can do quite a bit of work with determining deeper soil moisture based on readings from shallow soil moisture, if they kind of know the inputs of, if they know what's percolating beyond 2 inches or 6 inches, wherever your sensor is. That can still be usable information.
Okay, great. We're just going to take a couple more here. We're at the top of the
Okay.
hour, and then the rest of them, Peter, if you can answer by email, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And please do feel free to email me.
Yeah, Jack here wants to know, not only is snowpack important, but also when the snow falls. Spring snows tend to melt off rapidly, don't soak into the soils, feed rivers in bits and spurts rather than normal flow. So what about snowfall? Can you, what about that?
Yeah, so he's absolutely right that the timing of snow matters a great deal. And those spring storms, I think that even though they can melt more rapidly and recharge streams in fits and starts rather than in one bigger surge, the spring moisture is still incredibly crucial, because when you have those later spring snows and even rainstorms, generally you have cooler conditions and you're kind of lengthening the melt season, making the water more manageable. You're reducing the season in the summer where there's demand for water, so decreasing the water demand. And so those spring storms are still crucial, even though they don't add to snow, they may not add to snowpack quite the same.
Great. We're going to take this last one for today. Paula lives in Eastern Kentucky. And Paula, we definitely need more CoCoRaHS observers there. I was just there
Yes.
recently in August. So if you can do any recruiting there, that would really be helpful. But her question is, she lives in a forest in Eastern Kentucky, surrounded by hundreds of acres of forest land. I can mostly tell how droughty we are by the way the trees look and how the nuts and fruits are progressing. What else should I be looking for?
Yeah, so I would definitely be looking at what the soils are doing as well, whether it's muddy or not, whether the soils are dry or not, and whether or not that's normal for that time of year. But the tree health information is key. So if we had those kinds of tree health reports consistently, that would be very helpful for the US Drought Monitor and for kind of monitoring variations over time. So that's awesome. Those are exactly the kind of observers that we're looking for.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, folks, for your questions. And for those we didn't answer today, Peter will follow up with you here in the next week or so. As we close out today's program, we want to let you know that our next Weather Talk webinar will be taking place in November. So in almost 2 months from now, Alicia Wasula from STM Weather will look at how the use of weather experts in litigation. So that should be very interesting. We'll have the date and registration information out there on our website sometime in early October. And before I forget, when signing off today, please take the survey that's going to pop up on your screen. That's very useful for us to see how we're doing. So until we meet again, this is Henry Regis for the rest of the CoCoRaHS team saying goodbye for now and wishing each of you a great autumn in the weeks to come.